Good evening. My name is Ahmad Nassr Alah, and today I'm presenting my capstone research titled Refugees in Jordan: Challenges, Lessons, and the Way Forward. In this presentation, I will speak about how Jordan has become one of the world's largest refugee hosting countries and what that means for the country today in 2025. So now let me walk you through some of the main events that have shaped Jordan refugee experience over the last 75 years. Starting in 1946, Jordan gained independence from Great Britain. It was a young nation at that time, still building its institutions with limited resources and experience in governance. And nobody could have predicted what was about to happen in just 2 years later. Because in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War forced approximately 750,000 Palestinians to flee to Jordan. For a newly independent country, this was a massive shock, given the fact that Jordan's population nearly doubled overnight. 6 years after independence, Jordan made a major policy decisions. The government granted citizenship to most Palestinians through the nationality law in 1954. Fast forward in 2011, the Syrian war begins and thousands of Syrian refugees flee to Jordan. By 2014, Jordan was hosting 1.4 million Syrians. Then, years later, on October 7th, 2023, the Israeli-Gaza war once again raised fears of new displacements from Gaza to Jordan. And for the first time, Jordan took a firm public stance. The country will not accept more refugees, no more displacement, which shows how serious the situation has become for Jordan. And as we move into 2025, we've started to see international funding for Jordan cut back, and that makes it even more challenging for Jordan to support the refugees it already hosts. On this slide, I want to give you a quick overview of my paper and what it focuses on. So the main issue I'm looking at is the rising challenges for refugees hosting in Jordan, the economic, political, and social challenges that have built up over time. The purpose of this research is to assess Jordan's refugee policy in 2025 and see how the country is trying to balance its humanitarian duty with its own national stability and regional politics. My main focus is on two major refugee groups, Palestinians and Syrians. Since they make up the largest refugee groups in Jordan, they have lived there for many years and they continue to shape the country's economy and social structure till today. And finally, recent events like the Gaza war and the situation in Syria with the new regime and the decline of international aid make this the right time to re-examine Jordan's capacity and the direction of its refugee policy in the future. So to really understand Jordan's refugee experience, we have to look at Jordan's history and geography. First, Jordan is located in the center of the Middle East. To the north, Jordan borders Syria, to the east, Iraq, to the south, Saudi Arabia, and to the west, Israel and Palestine. More than 70% of the country is desert, so that makes life very challenging for Jordan, especially when it comes to water. Jordan is considered one of the most water-poor countries in the world. Jordan's population today is about 11.7 million people, and a big part of that population comes from decades of refugee hosting, mainly Palestinians and Syrians. Their presence has become a major part of Jordan's story and who the country is today. Economically, Jordan is a lower middle income country with very few natural resources. It doesn't have oil, it doesn't have gas like many of the Gulf countries. So it relies heavy on services, tourism, and foreign aid. And also, as I said, Jordan is very dependent on international aid. In 2025 alone, Jordan ranked among the top 5 recipients of international aid in the world, mainly from the United States, the European Union, and the Gulf states. So today, Jordan's refugee policy operates through two main systems. One with the UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees for Palestinians who were displaced after 1948, and another with the UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency for Syrians who arrived after 2011. So the United Nations established the UNRWA in 1949 to provide education, healthcare, and relief assistance to Palestinians refugees in Jordan. And decades later, in 2011, the Syrian civil war brought a new wave of refugees, and Jordan worked with the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, to manage the influx of more than 1 million Syrians. And at that time, Syrians were given temporary protection under humanitarian status. So Jordan's refugee challenge today is not just about numbers. It's deeply tied to serious economic stress, shrinking aid, and a change in the political climate. So Jordan has long depended heavily on foreign aid to support its economy and public services. In recent years, the country has ranked among the top aid recipients in the Middle East. Between 2021 and 2023, total foreign commitments, grants, and loans to Jordan reached several billions of US dollars. As a result of the funding cut in Jordan, some essential programs, including those which were funded by the USAID, have been suspended. This had immediate consequences on Jordan because it relies strongly on international aid to cover the refugee needs. And projects in education and health, for example, they were delayed or canceled. At the same time, Jordan's public debt has increased. By the end of 2024, the debts reach about $44 billion. Economically, growth has remained weak. Real growth was around 2.2% in 2024, while unemployment remains very high, over 20% in Jordan unemployment percentage. And all of that helps explain why recently high-level officials in Jordan have declared a firm no to accepting new refugees, even under pressure from allies such as the United States, as Jordan is trying to survive economically. And with the aid declining and debt rising, its ability to continue hosting refugees indefinitely is increasingly under threat. What we see in Jordan's refugee policy reveals a pattern that goes beyond humanitarian concerns. The policy is fundamentally political. Jordan approach has always been shaped by regional power dynamics and outside pressures, mainly from the US and Britain. And this was already clear in 1948 when granting citizenship to Palestinians was encouraged by external powers and not just by Jordan's own decision. Second, Jordan gave many Palestinians citizenship without a clear long-term strategy for how they would be integrated into the economy and the political system in Jordan, which created a situation where people hold Jordanian papers but still face uncertainty and limited opportunities till today. Third, international aid is closely tied to political interest. Jordan receives large amount of assistance, but this support often depends on strategic role and the foreign policy positions and not simply on Jordan's refugee needs. Finally, responses to each refugee wave have been short-term. Jordan usually manages crises as they come, but there's still no stable long-term vision for refugee inclusion or economic sustainability, which leaves both refugees and Jordan in a constant state of uncertainty. All these have brought Jordan in 2025 to a breaking point where a stressed economy and new regional wars make the government say very clearly that there can be no more refugees. Overall, the analysis shows that Jordan's refugee policy is now defined by three key realities. First, external drivers. Jordan's refugee policy is not really shaped by what Jordan wants. It's pushed and pulled by regional wars and big political decisions made outside Jordan. Second, aid reliance. Over many decades, Jordan has built a refugee system that runs on foreign money. UNRWA covers a lot of services for Palestinians. UNHCR supports Syrians. Other donors add more money. When the aid is strong, the system more or less works. But when the money is cut or delayed, everything starts to feel the pressure, especially Jordan. And that dependence is built into Jordan's structures of the system. Third, capacity is reached for Jordan. If we look at the economy, public services, the society, Jordan's is basically at its limit. Debt is high, jobs are limited, schools and hospitals are crowded, and infrastructure is struggling. Bringing in another large wave of refugees would push the system beyond what it can handle. And to Jordan, this is not just a debate or an opinion. This is the reality that policymakers in Jordan are trying to manage. Based on the previous findings, here's what I recommend for Jordan going forward. First, Jordan's positions of saying no to more big refugee inflows needs to be supported by the international community. The country is already under huge pressure, and the international community should respect Jordan's position in this matter. Second, Jordan needs new and more reliable funding partners. It should look for new long-term financial support that can keep services running for refugees and reduce the economic pressure on Jordan. Third, there should be more safe legal work opportunities for refugees. Jordan needs to take advantage of the refugees' presence. When refugees can work, they rely less on aid and that they can contribute to Jordan's economy. And finally, there has to be serious engagements on the international level to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Without addressing this root cause, Jordan will keep carrying the consequences of the region crises. Taken together, the evidence in this presentation shows that Jordan has effectively reached the limit of what it can absorb as a refugee hosting state. The 2025 context is especially severe. The international aid is declining. The Gaza war has raised a specter of new displacements from Palestine to Jordan. The returns to Syria remain slow and uncertain. Jordan is therefore managing a largely permanent refugee presence with limited external support. In this environment, refugee hosting is no longer understood only as a humanitarian obligation for Jordan. It has become a central question of national security and regime stability. Policy has been shaped by successive short-term responses to each crisis rather than by a comprehensive long-term plan. The main conclusion of this presentation is that Jordan's current restrictive stance is rooted not simply in political choice, but in accumulated economic, social, and demographic pressures that now define the boundaries of what Jordan can realistically sustain.